Our scripture reading today is from the book of John, chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. Listen now for the word of the Lord. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good morning.
Good morning.
If you would, pray with me. God of love and mercy, do not use my words, but your own. Teacher, speak through me and offer a message of meaning by this meditation that I give in worship and gratitude for you. Amen. So I'm going to start out with a little activity. It feels fitting. I love youth ministry and I love our kids, and I just think that we all need something to do sometimes because it's hard to pay attention. And I think that this will be fun for everyone just to do a little personal reflection. So in each of our pews, we have some pieces of paper and some pens. So if you want to kind of pass those along to your neighbors, when everyone has a piece of paper, let me know. So as you're getting your paper and a pen, just take a moment to think about what your title is. You can interpret that however you may choose, but maybe it's defined by your profession or your gifts, or maybe the way that you relate to certain people or other people in general. But just take a moment and write down a title that you would give yourself or that you identify with. We'll put those things, as soon as you're done writing those down, just to the side, but keep them close. So as we read through this passage in John 13, we realize that in weeks following Lent and Easter, that today's lectionary text encourages us to recall this conversation that followed that last meal. That last meal before Jesus was taken to the cross. As our passage begins, Judas has just been sent knowingly by Jesus to go and do quickly what he was about to do. Sent, even though Jesus knew he was going to betray him. He had predicted this while gathering with all the disciples, and though the book of John doesn't exactly depict them eating a meal, they were together, probably all reclined around a big table, with plates filled with only crumbs and cups left mostly emptied. Jesus then, in front of everyone, predicts Judas's betrayal. Peter even leans over and tells another disciple to ask him, who is he talking about? Jesus answers by saying, actually, it's the one who will receive this piece of bread. And that piece of bread he would dip into a dish and hand to one of his friends, one who had been with him all along the way of his journey in ministry. Then everyone watches as Judas takes that piece of bread and goes out immediately into the night. I mean, it's kind of an awkward dinner conversation. But this strange turn in an already eventful dinner took an even more shocking twist just moments later when Jesus begins talking about all this glorification business and how the Son will be glorified in God and God will also be glorified in the Son. And this is all being said while the sound of that door closing behind Judas is still ringing in the disciples' ears. But as he speaks, it still doesn't seem that the disciples quite understand what is happening. We see that after Jesus tells the disciples about the glorification that comes with his impending crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension, we also see that he explains to them that he's leaving and going somewhere that they cannot come. just after he announces this and tells them about a new commandment to love each other and to be known by that love, in the following chapter, Peter can't help but ask, where is he going? Jesus repeats himself, saying again that it's somewhere that Peter cannot follow. But Peter insists that he would follow him wherever he would go, and even lay down his life for Jesus. This is where the somewhat comical sense of repetition starts. And from chapters 14 to 16, just following our passage, we see the disciples continue to interrupt Jesus as he's simply just trying to give them some advice and words of encouragement before he leaves. It becomes clear as one reads that the disciples just don't seem to be getting it. But it's funny, I feel like we've all probably heard this trope before about those disciples, those silly disciples who are always so slow to understand and to get it. It must be really hard to hear directly from God, am I right? But really, as I was reflecting on this passage, I couldn't help but feel that I most closely identified with them. When things change, I tend to need some extra clear instruction. And when things are coming up and changing, I don't know exactly what to do. And I don't know about you, I'm pretty stubborn. But just as it is communicated a few times, I still need it a few times more to get it. And I and we, like the disciples, are simply human. We all require a little extra explaining sometimes. When Jesus says, where I am going, you cannot come, a new command I give to you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. It's so crucial that the disciples hear this final command that Jesus is giving to them. But instead, Peter can't help but think again, where is he going? As I think back to the time that I spent preparing to come here for seminary, I received lots of advice from people, warranted or not, and one conversation in particular that I had with a trusted friend and mentor of mine has stuck with me along the way. Justin, a teacher of mine in college, had been through seminary and told me that as he went through his seminary program, that he experienced some things and that I would probably do the same. He said that it would be a disorienting process. I know, really encouraging, right, to hear that I would be disoriented. But by being disoriented here, I would also then become reoriented along the way. This piece of advice has guided much of my time here and has felt entirely true every step of the way. That feeling of disorientation seems like it might just have felt true for those disciples too. You see, Peter just voices the thing that everyone else around the table was already thinking. Where is he going? I mean, Judas just left. Jesus has been saying all these crazy things at that dinner that was supposed to be nice, but then he starts getting weird when all of a sudden he's washing everybody's feet and he starts doing that thing again where he talks in cryptic metaphors about, you do not know what I am doing. And the one who is bathed does not need to wash anything but their feet. Peter and the rest of the disciples are just trying to figure out what is going on. Remember that these disciples had left everything behind, everything that they knew to follow Jesus, their jobs, their homes, their sense of security. After having left these comforts of home, the disciples followed their new trusted teacher, his instruction and counsel as best as they knew how. But along the way, they too became disoriented. Their leader's words and teachings, though sometimes metaphorical, would turn everything that they knew upside down. Religious leaders were challenging Jesus, his backwards approach to the law and the customs around Sabbath, and the ways that they were supposed to avoid these unclean people that were outcasts to their communities. But as Jesus taught them, they were constantly becoming reoriented by this law, this new law of love and abundance and grace. But it is a process. Throughout the Gospels, we see that it's a constant cycle of disorientation and reorientation for the disciples. In our passage for this morning, those disciples were becoming disoriented yet again. They were thinking that their leader was leaving them behind and It was someone that they had been following for oh so long. With no one to follow, where would they possibly go next? But right after Peter persistently asks where Jesus is going, Jesus starts to reorient his disciples by comforting them. Just after our passage in chapter 14, Jesus says, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places." But the disciples still lack confidence in those words. For 3 more chapters, there was this back and forth conversation, Jesus giving encouragements to them about things like the Holy Spirit, and the disciples just continued to interrupt him by saying things like, "What about this?" and "How about that?" All this because they're just anxious to be without a place or a direction or a leader. Maybe you too, like I, relate with these disciples. Anxiety can often be crippling when we wonder about what is next or what is to come. We ask questions like why and how constantly. Over and over again, we are forced through this lesson of life that change comes, loss happens, and new beginnings come as well. We can easily become disoriented by those things, but it's that short section that Peter seems to miss that we too often forget too. In just a few sentences, Jesus explains his new commandment to the disciples in an almost quasi-farewell address. He says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know who you are, my disciples, if you just love one another." After those 3 chapters of interrupting conversations in the back and forth between the disciples and Jesus, in chapter 17, he again reiterates through prayer the glorification of God through Jesus' sacrifice, the sanctification of the disciples, and the love of God being made known through them. This pattern and repetition was so imperative, not only for the disciples, but also for us as we read this. It takes repeating for something to stick. And even when the disciples question over and over again, Jesus continues to repeat himself. It would be kind of annoying, I would think, to keep repeating yourself. But just as Jesus kept repeating himself for the disciples, God also repeats for us so that we can be comforted. How often do we talk about love in this space? Often, right? And how often must we be reminded to really love one another well? How often do we think about loving our neighbors and the people that we encounter in spaces other than our church and how we love them well? How often are we comforted by the words of God, yet we still become anxious by the other things that come up over and over again? We get caught up in this cycle, much like Peter, and all the uncertainties of life, all of the change. You see, every single day we are becoming disoriented, and over time, reoriented. We are human beings, not all too excited for challenging times and change, but we have this very same instruction that those unsure disciples had as well. To love one another the way Jesus has loved us. And by this, everyone will know that we too are his disciples. So remember those pieces of paper you wrote on? Pick those up for me if you don't mind. Remember what you wrote? What's your title? Who have you been called to be? What have you been called to do, even in the midst of change? Now turn that piece of paper over and think about how Christ has gone before you and has expressed love for you in such an unfathomable way. Remember that you are called to love. Now, think about that title. Is it something that could change? Is it something that might remain the same for your whole life? Now, think about that title that God has given you. Maybe you're writing something different down on the other side of that piece of paper. Tuck it away somewhere after you leave today. And when we inevitably all begin to forget these encouragements that no matter where you go or what you might face, that title on your piece of paper is your first task. It's to love the way that God has so incredibly loved us first. Hang on to that title. What is it? How will you begin or continue to live into that title? Amen.